Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you back to the podcast that explores our place in time. And wow, is this ever a culminating moment? I'm getting tired of hearing myself say it, but for those of you who don't already know, in 2017, I authored a science fiction story, An Oral History of the End of Reality, about the proliferation of artificial intelligence-assisted media production and what it would do to us, how it would change our processes of social epistemology, what we regard as truth. And then reaching back even further, my essay, The Evolution of Surveillance, about how human technology coevolution can be understood as an arms race that stretches back over 500 million years in the evolution of new sensation, cognition, and the jamming of those systems. So, well, anyway, here we are, December 2022, and if you're listening to this, you already have an opinion about whether you feel that the proliferation of new tools like Midjourney and Lensa and ChatGPT are good or bad. It felt really important to me to host a kind of emergency congress about this topic with some of my artist friends, and I hope you enjoy this unedited 6-way sense-making session. But before we dive in, I want to thank new Patreon supporter Andre Silva and the folks who have purchased my music since the last episode, Shoji Shan, Cody Thomas Koyak, and Jeff Hansen. And the folks who have bought my art as well, although, as I will explain later in this episode, I'm starting to wonder why I even bother. But yes. There are so many ways that you can support what's going on here. And the best is patreon.com/Michael Garfield or michaelgarfield.substack.com if you don't particularly like being inundated with all of my new projects in a piecemeal fashion, but prefer a digested form. Okay, so with all that said, the holidays ahead, here we are in the Ragnarok of our creative epoch. It's my great honor to have Julian Picaza, Topher Sipes, Evo Heyning, Micah Daigle, Jamie Curcio on the show to discuss the adaptation of artists to our rapidly evolving technological milieu. Enjoy. All right. Wow. This is amazing that I have all of you here. I'm very, very pleased to have all of you join me for this special emergency roundtable. I feel like we're at Rivendell, the internet Rivendell, and I am Agent Elrond, and I'm saying that something very dark is gathering on the horizon, and we need to form a council and a fellowship to discuss this. But then again, it's a beautiful, efflorescent, wonderful thing too. So it's confusing. So what I would like to do is just go around and have all of you briefly introduce yourselves. And in so doing, talk about the ways that, like your history as an artist and the ways that you're using artificial intelligence in your artwork now, starting with Evo. And then I don't know if everyone's showing up in the same grid that I have. So probably not. So I will I'll just go after that. Yeah.
All right. So hi, I am Evo Heyning. I am in Los Angeles today. I've been a creator, producer for about 25 years. I've been an artist for 40. I started in painting and pastels, and I started writing stories about our relationships with AI about 20 years ago. I wrote a series 15 years ago, And I started developing that for virtual worlds in the metaverse around 2005, 6, 7. And today I create and generate across concept development work for clients, commissions, and my own work. And I have a design lab and gallery where we take art from throughout time, like antiques and vintage, and then we make new art and we put those things side by side. So that's called Reality Craft in Oakland.
Julian, because you're the one that got me into Midjourney in the first place, which you might, I don't know, you might be like, I regret doing this. But anyway.
No, I have few regrets in this life, and exposing the creative, intelligent people around me to new tools and technologies will never rank among them. However, I've on several occasions kind of worried about the long-term impacts that I have on people's lives, because I like to take people beyond the pale a bit out into the unknown. And different people handle that differently. Some people handle it really well and others freeze up. But I think it's important, to do that, to kind of walk out into the unknown on a regular basis and remind ourselves how much we don't know. So I'm really happy to have, helped bring you into this. In terms of who I am and my background, I am, I'd say, a creative technologist. I have a background in the arts and in the film industry, but it was mostly technology that kind of was at the core of my activities. So about 10 years ago, I found myself as a visual effects supervisor who was really curious about industrial design and automation, and got into things like CNC, and laser cutting, digital fabrication, and blockchain about 10 years ago. And so really, I'm somebody who's enjoyed the privilege of leading an interest-driven life, and I've mostly been exploring different creative applications of technology all over. I've run the gamut at this point, and I continue. So, diving in, I started with creating things with AI back, I'd say, in 2016. Although machine learning was still present, I wasn't doing much generative work with it until, Google dropped Deep Dream out there for everyone to play with, and all of a sudden there was all this fun style transfer stuff popping up. And so I got in and started training some of those and experimenting with what was possible. And these days I've been doing all sorts of things, but versus creative projects, what I'm really doing is I'm just seeing what the limits of the tool are. Half the time I'm experimenting to see, what does this thing do? And in the process, I create all number of things. I make up projects to test its capacities. I do that with every tool I use. But I don't think we've even begun to find the limits of these things. So I don't even want to define what I'm doing too much yet, other than exploring and experimenting.
Other than fingers, right? Fingers.
Right. Yeah. If we could get hands down
for now,
and and the eyes to stop crossing, I would say, okay, I think we could do something. Until then, it's all speculative,
James.
Yeah. Well, hands are still hard to draw as a visual artist, whether or not you're using technology. So it probably will be a little while. Yeah, we're all kind of eclectic here. So I've been transmedia artist, musician, and writer for depends how you count it, but I guess about 20 years. Involved in a bunch of different media startups. So like the first one was basically my friends and I out of college, kind of starting our thing, and that actually took off for a little while, surprisingly. So technology has kind of always been a part of my artistic process. I came into music production right when digital kind of became a thing, and the same is somewhat true of visual art. I mean, before Photoshop was really well adopted, I had kind of collaging and visual art by the old-fashioned way as two different kind of tracks, And then once Photoshop and Illustrator and all that kind of became part of it, mostly Photoshop really, they gradually started to dovetail together, and until kind of my process kind of integrated both those things in terms of like photo bashing and that stuff. And then, also like traditional painting and mixed media, I kind of see it all as like a means to an end. So the visualization apps like Midjourney seem somewhat familiar to me in a way, although of course what they're, the results that are starting to be produced seem light years beyond, other generative processes, but it feels very familiar to me in a way that it seems like I think some other artists don't necessarily have that experience of sort of like, oh, I know what to do with this, at this stage. I mean, like you were saying, like it's happening, it's moving so fast that it's very hard to predict where it'll be, even 3 months down the road, because it's still in an experimental phase.
Topher, my old friend.
So I've been drawing for as long as I can remember. And I was really inspired by cartoons and animation comics growing up. And then I studied graphic design and illustration at university and was doing fabrication design for theme parks and children's playgrounds for a while, which is what kind of introduced me to the 3D space and thinking more spatially. And then for a while, I was very much into environmental interpretation and have since, to this day, have a lot of environmental conservation oriented work. Around that time, I also got into performance work because I used to be a musician, but then I sort of integrated that understanding into using sort of visual instruments. So, using a digital drawing Wacom tablet or a touch screen and later VR to project onto musicians and dancers and stages, etc. And then more recently, art directing VR experiences that are sort of in the digital therapeutic realm. Also very much inspired, influenced by various types of flow arts of movement and dance and treating, the page or the screen like a dance floor, improvising and using pareidolia to kind of find forms in the chaos. And then also almost 2 decades of like pretty dedicated dream work and dream documentation as well. So using AI image generation, I actually, with the exception of like a few social media stories, I actually haven't published like any posts of what I've been doing with it because it's been part of a larger process that is sort of behind the scenes, and it's never necessarily the end image, but it's actually part of an iterative process for bringing things along the way. I'll leave it at that.
That leaves us with you, Micah. You're kind of an outlier here, and I appreciate that, I think.
In what way?
In the sense that, I don't see you as a working professional artist. Like, you are a very playful, multimedia, exploratory type person, but you're somebody that seems like these new tools have really just allowed you to just step forward and rock out in a way that has completely astonished me and so many other people, and really separates, in my mind, there's definitely like a breakwater point between this and like the stuff that you were doing before. I don't know but I mean, here I am commenting on you before I've allowed you to introduce yourself. So.
Sure. Well, it's interesting to know how you experience me. Yeah, my relationship to the label artist has been complicated. I, like everyone else here, has been creating stuff like compulsively since I was a kid. I think it started actually for me when I was like 4 years old, and I broke my leg, and I was in the hospital for the first few months of school. So all the kids were like meeting friends and like doing like social school things, and the only thing I had to do was read and draw. And I remember I like created this like a storybook, an illustrated storybook of a boy who broke his leg. At the time, I didn't know I was doing like art therapy on myself, but I was. And like from that point on, I just always used art primarily as like an introverted processing tool. And it wasn't necessarily something that was like for other people. And I would like often get like in trouble in class because I'd be drawing instead of, paying attention to the teacher, Yeah. And at a certain point, I feel like my art got good enough to start sharing it. And then I became like known as an artist in school. And I got like the superlatives, like most artistic, blah, blah, blah. And I thought that I was going to be an artist. Like that's where it seemed my life was going. I wasn't able to get into like a good art school. So I went to a state college and the art program sucked. And I basically like flunked out of my art classes because I found them all really boring. And at the time, our philosophy program was really awesome. I just like happened to stumble into a philosophy course and got really interested in like the ethics of emerging technology and AI, and brain computer interfacing was like the first version of that was like being developed at that time. So I kind of like made a break with art. Like I stopped drawing for probably like 10 years. And it was like such a big part of my life, but I kind of like went into this like philosophical activist channel of my life, and I became an activist, and I like worked on nonprofits for a long time. But then this like creative part of me like kept getting tapped into as I was working on that stuff, and I essentially became like a full-time designer. I have a design practice, and I would say a like professional artist at this point, but my art is through design, brand design. I do like, a variety of things within like creative professional label. But now with AI, it's kind of like the merging of like all these interests, and I'm just fascinated by it. And there's a lot more that I can share about my relationship to it. But yeah, I feel like I've never had the patience. I've always been kind of ADHD. So I've never had the patience for all of the ideas that I have in my head. I have like a billion ideas, and then I like grab one, and if I can't like get it finished within 24 hours, I'm like on to the next one. And so I have like a trail of unfinished projects. And I think that the most exciting thing to me about the AI stuff is the ability to churn out new ideas and get from like idea to finished product within less than an hour, rather than it taking weeks and then giving up on it. So that's me.
Yeah, and to that point, I guess I should be be careful about how I talk about people. But like for instance, I no longer think of myself as a professional artist. In that, just in case, I don't know who's going to listen to this, but like my first contract actually to do art was to come up with mock-ups for horizontal format ad placements for Disney MGM Studios' Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, because this is a vertical elevator drop ride that apparently no one at Disney, including the Imagineering, could figure out how to like represent this on a billboard or a bus. And so my father, who was working at Disney at the time, said, "I bet my son can, because he draws all the time." And I gave them a 4-panel thing, and they used all 4 panels. My dad gave me $120, and I was 12 years old. And that's what started this. Meaning both the idea that I could make art for money, and also the recognition that I'm going to be horribly exploited by corporations. Because obviously, like, it's probably worth more than $120, even in 1994. So, but, for 13 years after college, I was just piecemealing a career out of live painting and music performance and public speaking and scientific illustration and contract illustration, for whoever would have me, merchandise design, and that's what brought me into the orbit of all of you fine people. Micah, whom I met while I decided I was just going to hitch a ride out of Burning Man and backpack around San Francisco for a couple of weeks in 2008. And I met you at the couch surfing mixer there with Troy Dayton. And, Topher, I met through Art Outside Festival in Texas. And so, it's just like, but, now I work in science communication, and I have a family, and those days are behind me. And like, the only way I can paint now is if I have a child with me painting, often not like on the same canvas. Like the only way I can make music is like waiting until they're asleep and then using my headphones and, like ingesting things that I shouldn't to keep me up later than I should be, that, so that I can carve out this time alone. And so the AI stuff has been really interesting for me, because I feel that, one, I really sympathize with you, Micah, in that the ADHD thing, I feel like, working in social media has destroyed my single-pointed focus. Like, it has made me this sort of like Avalokitesvara of, like juggling 9 million things and feeling like I can like legitimately track 2 conversations at the same time, but at the same time also having to have a multifocal sort of life. in that respect in order to get anything done. And then the other part is just, it's a matter of time and not being, just, we're like, I think that the sort of the umbrella of this whole conversation is that this was the year that it really felt like that moment, to get kind of Ian Malcolm about this, that moment in Pirates of the Caribbean, when you're about to go over the waterfall, and you can feel it. You can feel the front of the boat is tipping. And I feel like that's where we are as, technologically as a species right now. We are like,
with everything.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like we're no longer trying to steer away from the falls. Now we're asking, do we hold onto the boat? Do we need parachutes? Do we learn to fly? What the fuck is this all about? And so that's the question I have for all of you, really. And you all can whoever, popcorn this, but like, how in your own lives, and then maybe like, how do you see generally people responding to this stuff? How do you see people adapting to it? And then how do you see people not adapting to it? Like, how do you see it like ruining people too? And so that, where are the potholes that we need to drive around?
Can I interject here? Because I have some thoughts about what you were just saying before you posed that question that kind of segue well into it. They might help frame it. So I found I could really relate to both Micah and yourself, Michael, when you were kind of, negotiating with the word artist or professional artist or designer. And I found myself trading back and forth between those two taxonomic, which pigeonhole do I put myself in for somebody? Because I'm really in both. I'm really in many. I am also that many-armed Avalokiteshvara. And so people want me to have that very simple business card title, and I've never been that. And I don't want to deny myself any of them. I mean, I barely play music ever anymore, and I'm not giving up my musician title. That's my religion. That's my truest sacred spiritual connection. Even if nobody ever hears me play another note of music again, or I never touch another music instrument, I will still be a musician. I'm not giving up that credential. So, taxonomy matters because I've seen, in terms of what potholes that people have hit, I've seen at least two places where the naming and phrasing around certain things has confused the public. And I deal in a lot of my work with the public becoming confused already about technology platforms that I work with because they're poorly understood by the general public. So when in 2016, when we all started making 2017, style transfer, neural network based artwork, nobody was calling it AI art. Nobody used the term AI at all. We were trying to come up. We're like, is it neural art? I don't know what I'm doing. I'm making images using this cool algorithm to do style transfer. But it definitely wasn't called AI art. And I've seen people respond badly to the term art being used because they're like, robots can't make art. Right. And they think there's just a basic flaw there you shouldn't even call it art because there was a robot there. And then they say AI, and that's another taxonomic issue because most of the general public, when they hear the term AI, they're thinking AGI. They're thinking artificial general intelligence, a thinking machine. They're not thinking like a machine learning algorithm, which is basically most software these days. Like we're getting past halfway where ML, machine learning is in everything. So even calling it AI is confusing to the public because they think there's another consciousness there, and there isn't. We're not implying that we should take AI out of the taxonomy because people think that means there's a thinking robot, and there is not. There's no sentient robot involved, Yeah. So that's my first offering.
So Julian,
I'm sorry.
I prefer to use generative arts, for example, or other terms that aren't AI art. I'm curious what other language the rest of you use that help to maybe demystify, but also clarify how your artistic and creative and curatorial and directorial eye informs your process now.
Generative art definitely is a good one. I use that a lot, but I've been trying to use visualization app more when I'm specifically talking about Midjourney or Stable Diffusion or any of those things because of the reasons that you gave. And I think people would react a little bit differently if it was I'm creating this thing with a visualization app, then I created it with AI. It's like, oh, Terminator. It's trying to take over. It's a very
exactly. They're like, I use Skynet to make art.
Right.
Yeah. It's confusing. I tend towards generative art as well. That's my preferred term. But I like throwing some of the other technical terms in there because they're accurate, even if they haven't stuck. Like image synthesis is a perfectly accurate term technically to use for this. And I like saying diffusion. I want people to know this is diffusion. I like to mention latent space. Nobody's talking about latent space. And latent space was like the major pivotal point of this generation. It was how they used latent space. Everything else, the natural language processing and the diffusion were not that new, but the way they used it and the way they used latent space specifically is what was so new this time around.
And words like style transfer have been done throughout our history. And so that can be a leveler for people to understand why style transfer modes and schools have become popular throughout time, and that this may be just another school of art, the way, Impressionism, they were called impressionists as sort of a derogatory term at the time, right? So there's ways in which these sort of schools of art form generatively, and they have these emergent qualities the same way we're experiencing now.
A few things.
Using AI personally, and I think it's mostly because I just coming from like a brand strategy background, there's a certain acceptance of just like that's the brand now. Like there's no kind of like putting that back in the bottle. So maybe like I don't think that we can put AI back in the bottle, but I think that where the like battle lines are right now around branding this stuff is around art and around, is it like AI assisted art? Is the AI assisting me as the artist, or is the AI the artist and I'm merely assisting it? I think that's the main debate right now. And
what about AI design? Like you mentioned the word design earlier, would people be less kind of up in arms if we said I'm using AI for design
possibly,
craft?
Yeah. I mean, I do use those words for two very distinct purposes. Like to me, art is a loosening process and design is a tightening process or a converging process. Design is about meeting needs through like well-designed products or brands, or there's a strategy to it, let's say. Like design always has an outcome that you want, whereas art is like, this thing is coming through me and I don't know what it wants to be, but I'm just going to allow it to be, And I think those are two different processes, and some people are artists and they're definitely not designers. I know plenty of those folks. Some of my design peers are not artists at all. They don't know where to start if they're not given some kind of like goal or need or something. And then there are people who kind of cross the chasm. So one thing I didn't mention in my intro is that I'm now using generative AI art in my design practice, which is interesting, and it is very different than what I'm doing with my like weird AI art experiments. I could go into more of how that looks different, but I think it's actually pretty distinct. So
that's relatable.
Micah, you actually had a thread about that specific distinction, I don't know, a couple of months ago on Facebook. And if you could dig up the link, I'd love to post that in the show notes, talking about art versus design and, the like dilating versus constricting sort of piece of it, which I think they're one of the people, like the lights on my shoulder in this conversation. It's the first person I was able to wrangle into a conversation on AI art about this stuff. It was J.F. Martel. When I had Jim Rutt invited me onto his show, and I said, well, you can't have me on the show without JF, because JF wrote this amazing book, Art in the Age of Artifice, or Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice, in which he makes a very similar kind of distinction. It rhymes with your own distinction a lot, where he's saying that, that artifice is basically the use of technique to achieve a desired result in the mind of the. And it's interesting how that syncs up with someone who I asked to talk about these things with, but I have not heard back from, perhaps unsurprisingly, who is Alex Gray, whose book, The Mission of Art, really changed the way that I make art, changed the way that I think about what I do as a creator, in that, Alex was saying, well, you have this imprint, this like holographic signature of yourself, that is put into the work and then is transmitted like in a Buddhist sense. It's like a direct transmission into the whoever beholds the work. And so, in a way, like even unintentionally, you are creating a kind of singular experience in someone who, even unwittingly. I remember Robert Venosa said something, maybe, 13 years ago in an interview on Reality Sandwich back when it was still, like legit, about this, saying that, he felt that even if no one had no idea what he was working with, had not had a psychedelic experience, that his work was kind of dangerous because it was going to induce in them something transformative. And so, it's interesting, to think maybe this is not where I expected this conversation to go, but like it does kind of make me wonder about, even JF will say that this is not a strict binary, because obviously whatever we intend for something that we create to be, it's going to find affordances, or people like William Gibson said, the street finds its own uses, right? Like people will take it up and repurpose it for unintended, stuff. And so, yeah, like, and then if the same is true for like, even like the bioaccumula fe post-human turn on design, which is that, like even with design, we don't really, where does the intention for a design come from? It's almost a critique of free will in that, like, it's, we are just sort of this interference pattern of environmental influences.
It's to be like a process of back and forth. I mean, even if you're working yourself, like alone in a room, at least mentally, I feel like it's very much a sort of process of sort of being, putting yourself in different perspectives and playing the role of different people if there's no one else to work with. I like working with collaborators in different mediums, but if I don't have something to collaborate with, I'll do it with myself, right? I think, that is one way to think about AI, although, of course, as we've all discussed, it's better not to think about it as having agency of its own, because it's not accurate. It's more like cloud formation or crystallization or something like that, like a natural process that you're participating in to some extent.
And a fascinating one. I mean, when I think about what ultimately these diffusion clouds are, they're like mathematical averages, they're really impossible to anticipate in many respects. So I'm with you on the cloud formation or crystallization. They're definitely a different kind of math than we're used to seeing. So it's hard to talk about them in a frame that is really coherent. I mean, even photo bashing or any of the ways we've interacted digitally with images in the past, they really fall short of what's going on here. And, I feel like I have to get long-winded with the public to try and put an accurate picture in their mind of what's happening behind the scenes or under the hood. And that's why I think the taxonomy, is so important. How do we talk about the tools we're using and what they are? Because it's hard for people to understand what's happening under the hood with most modern technology products. So you really do need to frame very carefully for them. And when the public, imagination gets captured by something and we end up with everybody's calling it AI art, and we have to deal with the fact that more than 50% of the people that hear that term, they're going to think that there's a consciousness there. They think when you say AI, they think the sci-fi concept of AI. They think Hal, make me a painting, please, Hal. And that's just not what's happening. So I don't know.
There also does seem to be a sense that that the corporations that are, in a lot of cases, it's not even a corporation, it's actually a research lab, but the perspective is that there are these giant corporations that are already very involved in this process, and they are doing beta testing on a lot of big corporations right now, but there isn't a big offering yet. So there isn't it's kind of I think it's important to look at the ways that this can be misused. We'll get into that a little bit, but it's kind of jumping the gun a little bit to talk about the evil machine, the evil empire that's already trying to destroy art with AI when it's it's a research lab with 11 people, an open source project. They're having some VC offerings, but it's still in the business world, it's not, people are kind of still in early testing, which is crazy to think about. But
and it's paired programming. We've done paired programming for decades. Now we are just doing human AI paired programming in chat, in video, in imagery across the board. Having our tools, sort of effectively trained to work with us, it makes us all better, ideally. Not every tool is trained to do that, but if you're working well to create the tool that you need to do the work you're creating, like refining your artist brushes or your sculptor tools the same way an artisan would have done throughout time, I love the not just the fluidity, but the way in which each of us has learned to sort of shape our toolkit to work with our vision and to work with the kinds of things that we want to be generating and creating moving forward, even if that's at the edge of open source or at the edge of what tooling is currently providing. We're learning to bring all of these tools together, maybe experiment and try new things, and then invite other people to participate in that process. I think some of you are really great at getting a ball rolling or like playing a great jazz riff that everyone else wants to riff on. And that to me, that's the joy, the riffing, right? The jazz of it. It's exciting.
Yeah. And some of them are created in a way where you can actually, work as a group where you're kind of tossing those visual ideas back and forth and, doing different upscales or renders off of the same idea, like in the same shared chat space or whatever, which is really pretty cool.
Well, and I started hosting salons and doing galleries for the same reason, right? Inviting people in to play together, to do concept work together, or just to explore and try new things together too.
Topher?
Yeah, there's a framing I've been using a lot lately is language-driven image generation. Because when I think of, let's say, generative art by itself, I mean, for a while I've been using something like Blender, say, and using the node system in there to do generative work, but it's a very different process than Midjourney or DALL-E or something, or even, there's other types of non-digital, non-machine learning, algorithm-based types of generative work, like a harmonograph, having a pendulum with a pencil and just like letting it go, and then it'll generate, forms. And so that including language into that, I think helps to clarify a bit.
I like that. And I'm excited about increasingly it not being the primary prompt. Like, I've been using image prompts in my Midjourney creations, and now increasingly photo bashing and like just creating sketches or like doing a quick photo bash as an input of something that I want to see. And then using like very, very minimal stylistic like words as prompts. And I'm so excited about the day where I can draw on my iPad and it starts to fill it out. Like, I'm sketching and I'm just talking to the AI and I'm saying, hey, can you shade this in a black and white halftone motif or something? And as I draw it, my line forms.
Yeah. Have you used Viscom?
What was that?
Have you used Viscom?
I don't think so, but there are so many tools right now. I may have. Vizcom. That's something that's being used in, for example, the automobile and product design industry, where you doodle and you can also have a text prompt and it will, generate like more complete renders in real time.
Son of a bitch.
Yeah.
This is exactly what you were just talking about. Oh my God. This is the problem with this. Like, this is the world. Again, another William Gibson thing is like the future is already here. It's just distributed unevenly. It's just like, all of us think it's like we're on a frontier, but it's this n-dimensional manifold. And we're just like, that thing, it's here now, which is the thing that like, and so, I mean, maybe this is actually kind of a more pressing question because, somebody actually posted this precise question to the Future Fossils Facebook group, which to me suggests that they've never actually listened to a live recording of one of my shows. Because every time I play the song Life Finds a Way, I talk about the idea that like you're going to be dreaming with a headband on and you're going to wake up with your dreams 3D printed in the room with you. So you're going to have to like, Topher, I mean, to your dream practice specifically, and I hope that we one day get a one-on-one and we have a whole episode with you about this stuff. But like, the notion that like in Michael Crichton's totally underappreciated novel Sphere, where like everyone develops these powers to just manifest whatever they're thinking. And then at the end of the novel, they decide that they don't like it and that they're going to manifest the reality in which they forget that they have these powers and their brains don't do this anymore. And I think that, like this is, I mean, it's sort of like Wonder Woman 1984, which I brought up in the panel I did with EFF Austin a few episodes ago, where it's like, there is a line where our ability to create things just by thinking about them immediately and to have them become physical objects, like there has to be a threshold. Like there has to be either like a firewall so that we're not just like ideating suicide and then accidentally killing ourselves. Or there has to be some sort of economic constraint.
That's what the big red button is for.
Yeah, right. Or like, oh yeah, that's the meme of the guy. Which big red button do I push? So
right.
Yeah, I mean, so this is that's an interesting question to pose to you all, which is sort of like, at what point do you actually find that it's no longer fun? Right? Or like, at what point does this become, because I need to bring this guy into the conversation, Steven Zapata, who's an illustrator on YouTube and Patreon, and posted this very long critique of AI artwork that I will share in the show notes. And I think the most important of his critiques, in my opinion, is the critique that he made that rhymes with something, that Herbert Simon said in 1971. It said, thanks to Richard Doyle for turning me on to this. I use it in my email signature at SFI. He said, information consumes attention. And so a world that is saturated with information is a world in which people are impoverished with their attention. And so, Zapata's critique was that it's going to become so easy to make art that no one will be able to actually get anyone to look at art. And I think that's like that, it's already the case that, we live in a world where social media, everyone is shouting and no one's really listening in a way, or it's like, I mean,
just partially because of algorithms, that's a whole other thing.
Right. Yeah. And to be fair, like, what is it? 99% of people on social media are just lurking, reading other people's posts. But like, but at the same time, it really it's obvious to everyone, I think, that the competition for attention has become the primary thing, because it is the one thing that we don't know how to scale with digital media. Right. And so, yeah, I'm just going to like lay that all out before you, and I hope that you all will riff on that.
I think that the part of that concern I share as well. I think it's more about, it'll increase the perception that art is easy. It won't make art easier. At least it won't make it easier to make quote unquote good art, whatever the hell that is. But, it'll make it seem easier, and that'll have effects. It'll have downstream effects, certainly. I don't think it'll make people want to stop looking at it. At least so far in human history, that hasn't happened. It would certainly be a first. People would say, okay, I'm done. No more images for me ever again. I don't want to look at anything. But
I think it's less that they would want to stop looking at it, and more what we already see happening with, let's say, all the streaming networks. Like, when I was younger, movies were this magical place that stories went to be revered, and now it feels like it all just kind of washes right off. It's like you have this deluge of like a fire hose of media coming at you, and it's all really high quality. The shows on all the streaming networks are great, better than old TV quality, and yet, none of it really sticks. Like, and we've gotten even pickier about, we're like, oh no, this particular Lord of the Rings wasn't convincing enough. And that particular Game of Thrones, I didn't like the wigs. And so we'll just throw the whole thing away, even though it was probably the most convincing, period piece anybody has seen for 10 years or whatever. And so, I experienced this. I'm in Miami right now for Art Basel. And I've said many years during Art Basel, like, that the worst thing about Art Basel is that it's too much great art at the same time. So you don't really have any time to just sit with one piece and be like, this is amazing. I'm going to sit here. I remember doing that at the Louvre, or places where they have these giant epic pieces of work. I would just sit down and stare and have a special moment with that work. And when you're completely saturated in it and overwhelmed with media stimulation, you just don't have the bandwidth to do that with, like, you might not even hear a song all the way through because you're busy and you got to your destination. You don't have time to sit in your car and listen to the rest of the song. You got to go. And so that's what I worry. Not that people will stop paying attention to art, but that it'll just be so everywhere, they'll start tuning it out even more by necessity.
Yeah.
I definitely respect that concern, and I feel it as well, of just not just the deluge of art, but the deluge of information and everything that we're dealing with on the cusp of the singularity or whatever this is. But I think, like, I think it's not a bad problem if the problem we're dealing with is that, like, more people are creating art and the world is a more beautiful place. And, it's kind of, it's the Burning Man problem, right? There's like too many things to experience. And so you get overwhelmed and you're like, I only scratched the surface of everything that's out there. But it's like not a bad problem to have. You just got to work on your own FOMO and your own like filters and your own relationship to it. I think I think Zapata was really right about a lot of things. I'm not super concerned about this concern. I'm concerned about who owns this stuff. Is it ethical for these for-profit private companies to be making huge loads of money off of data sets that have been, grabbed by other artists? I don't think that's an easy answer, but I think that those questions are like really important. So I think those are the things I'm concerned about. Like it's all the stuff where like we can't have nice things because capitalism, right? Like I would love to be living in a world where people are just creating like art generating machines, and like that's filtering all of the amazing art is the hardest thing we have to deal with. But right now we have to deal with like, how are artists going to get paid? Because now what has happened to every other industry where, those who have the tech to be able to automate it are basically scooping up all the value and the money from that. That's now happening to art. And I worry about that a lot. I think I was like really impressed by Kevin Kelly's article about AI art in Wired. I think he made a lot of really good framing decisions about how to talk about AI art, but I think he got this wrong. I think that he kind of like hand waved it away, and he's like, "Oh, it's not a big deal," but I'm deeply concerned about it.
I think Kevin Kelly does that. That's like he's built his entire career. I took him to task on this the last time I spoke with him. Anyway, okay.
It's a really complicated. I mean, I think there is definitely concern about corporate ownership and use. Like there's cause for concern there, but it's hard to talk about because there's so many sort of sides to it. I mean, one thing I do wonder oftentimes is, like I said, what corporations exactly are they concerned about right now? Versus what corporations are worried about in 5 years. Disney, but like right now, I don't know. I mean, I've listened to the journeys, like developer talks and whatnot. I don't know them that well, so maybe there's like nefarious things going on I don't know about. But they seem to be like a pretty small like research group that's, they seem to be making enough to grow, but it's not like this big money making scheme,
In my experience, that's how every startup sounds.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. It's like right now, I realize I'm saying that right now. We don't know what's going to happen when $1 billion is dropped in front of their face, but
right.
Yeah.
At a certain point, the company grows beyond the founder's ability to rescue it from the Moloch beast that is capitalism and all of the like bad incentives and stuff, right? And so It doesn't really matter if founders are good people or bad people. It's going to turn into a profit maximizing machine if it's set up in that way. And I do have friends that are working on this. I want to give a shout out to my friend Derek, who's working on a project called Purpose, and it's basically helping startup founders to create basically like the corporate structure that is in line with their values, the corporate structure and investment structure, so that it doesn't end up turning into a monster. I don't actually know if that's possible, but at least people are working on it. But I think that that's where you solve these things. You don't solve them on the level of like the technology itself or having conversations about the technology. It's like you've got to actually like fix the problem at the capitalism level.
Sure. Oh, it's time to be concerned about like the sale of information. It's probably like 20 or 10 years ago, with cookies and social media and everything else. We've been selling our information for quite a long time. But
does anyone else find it hard to hear James?
Oh, sorry, Mark.
James, you're quiet, but we'll fix it in post.
Okay.
So the question. Yeah, and I want to double down on this with you all because I think that, most of the time when I hear people talking about this stuff, the people that have the greatest problem with it fall into, like, it seems to me one of either two camps. And actually, Micah, I'm totally going to link to your AI art menagerie of people using AI art because I feel like you pegged all of us in this in some way. But, like, there's the people that generally fear change, again, you brought up Kevin Kelly, there's Stuart Brand who said, when progress happens too fast, then people call it, change and they ask it to stop. He said, in his book, The Clock of the Long Now. And I think that's accurate. Other people have said that technology is just whatever was invented, like basically like since you grew up. And you don't recognize all of the other, like the mountain of technologies that you're standing on. And you just think of that as just part of, the human experience, but it's not. In the same way that all of us think of the atmosphere that we breathe as just like this thing that's always been here, but it hasn't. been this way. Like, it was fabricated by living organisms hundreds of millions of years ago. And so like there was a time when you could go back to Earth and there were things living on Earth, but you'd have to wear a spacesuit. And so, but the question is not, how is that? It's how fast is that happening, right? And are we within the window in which we can actually evolve to keep pace with it, or is it just, is it beyond our ability to do so? So there's people with that concern, but then there's like this other thing, which is that, and generally people just fearing strangeness, fearing otherness, and I feel like those people, all of you have spoken earlier to that, and to, how do we talk about this in a way that creates more affordances for people to kind of like understand that this isn't necessarily, at least in its current formulation, radically different from what has come before. But then there are these other people that are looking at it purely in terms of the creative economy. And, the thing that I think empowers me to just enjoy these tools, frankly, is the fact that I'm not making art for a living. I think that when I look at this, and I know, basically all of us have had this conversation in one form or another on social media at some point, but like, it seems as though you cannot talk about what a world saturated with AI artwork looks like without, like, we have, to another Lord of the Rings reference is like, the orcs have penetrated Helm's Deep at this point, right? Like we have finally reached the point that most people, even 2 or 5 years ago, never thought was going to happen. And so the whole question of what is the end point of automation, when we're talking about things like, Milton Keynes and the 1930 essay, economic prospects for our grandchildren, and people wanted automation to be this thing that liberated human beings into a life of leisure and creativity and exploration and, like, Star Trek style. But one of the weird things about Star Trek is that, they don't adequately explain the post-scarcity economics of that whole situation. And so, like, we see this and we see that. And then the other fork in the road is like, The Road, Cormac McCarthy. It's just like total desperate misery and despair. And so, obviously, if an organism gets big enough, at some point, it can't just expect nutrients to diffuse through it passively. It needs to create a heart. It needs to pump blood. And so people like Brian Arthur, back in his McKinsey essay in 2017, were saying that we absolutely need UBI beyond a certain point with automation. But, it's like, how much of the organism has to die from asphyxiation before a heart will evolve? And, like, can we evolve a heart fast enough? These are the kinds of questions that I have for you. And I'm curious what you all think about this stuff.
It's funny, I was just having a conversation about how it's almost impossible to have a conversation about AI without talking about UBI. For that very reason, that's a tough one, though, in terms of speculation, isn't it?
I was just reading a meme about an hour ago that Sophie Strand posted with a bunch and it was basically someone saying, we can't decolonize everything, y'all. Some things just gotta die or burn. And so, I think, yes, what you were saying earlier, that the future is already here, is just not evenly distributed. I think a lot of really great things have become possible, are possible now, and have been going. I don't think everyone's going to get to, enjoy the progress. I don't think it's going to work for everyone. And I don't think it should. I don't think it's a better world that it works for everyone or that everyone has the same results. I think diversity is ultimately messy, and that in order for this to move forward, which it's not going to stop, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. There are going to be mistakes. There will be industries and things that will be disrupted, that will have negative effects, and there will be disruptions that have positive effects. Like, it's not ever going to land at an all black or all white conclusion. Like, the fork in the road there's just more than one fork, more than one road. And a lot of them are going to happen at the same time to different people in the same places. I know that's not much of an answer, because I'm kind of saying everything, but I do think it's going to be like that. It's going to be a bit of a
everything all at once.
Yeah, a jackpot, as the peripheral likes to call it, like just a bunch of things happening at the same time that they converge in ways that we would never be able to effectively anticipate, and we can just hope that we can respond to them effectively. There was some really interesting singularity fiction in a collection of short stories by Ken Liu recently that covered very extensively a lot of like singularity stories and AI and transhumanism kind of crossover into the digital. And you're not going to have one mass reaction. You're going to have a bunch of different reactions and a bunch of people dealing in different ways and changing their mind midstream, being like, no, I'm against it. Actually, okay, let's try it, like that. So I don't know. I wish I could get ahead of it mentally, but I think I've stopped trying. I think I'm just trying to stay tuned. It's moving so fast.
Just stay on the surfboard.
Yeah, exactly.
It can feed that which wants to be both fluid and plural in the human. So being able to create all of these personas and identities that let us play out all of those creative ideas, that's very empowering in a place where you can't do that any other way, right? And we've seen this for the last 20 years, but we're seeing it show up in new ways. When I went to speak at the World Government Summit, we talked about identity and plurality and the rub between, wanting to control this, right? It's command and control dynamics that are crumbling. It's capitalism that's crumbling. And I'm okay with that. Like, I'm okay with capitalism crumbling because everyone recognizes that they have creative power again, Like, I'm okay with letting that old world die so that we can create something better from that.
So far as visualization apps are concerned, I'm with you. I feel like my greater concerns about AI are in other fields than the arts. In terms of, like weapon systems and biotechnology, that sort of thing. There's also great things that can be done with it, but as much as I've committed my life to being an artist, but nevertheless, compared to climate change or all the nukes being launched, that sort of situation, it's just a picture. And I'll be crucified for that.
I would hope we would use our tools effectively to help simulate and then plan our cities effectively for climate before, Miami is underwater, for example.
Yeah, AI could help with that too. Yeah, it's true.
Yes, but it has been hard to get people to fund those sorts of initiatives. I think up until this point, people couldn't see how AI was going to inform a process. And I think that is the sort of tidal shift we've seen this year for people. They get it now.
Yeah.
Some do.
Yeah, I gotta admit that speaking of surfing, I think that's an apt metaphor to surf the edge of this. And, also I surf between being artist and quote unquote designer too, and work in both of those spaces. And there's times I definitely experience on and off, and I've been feeling it again recently, like what I would call novelty fatigue. And I've been tracking a lot of this stuff for a while, and it's, with a few exceptions, it's hard for me to really, at least at this point, really find other people's work extremely interesting and deep. I'm exposing myself to a lot of different use cases constantly, and there's a few things that are catching my attention, but most of it is just bouncing off of me, and it feels a little exhausting now that the rate at which the usage and accessibility of this is just happening more exponentially, and seems to that will continue to be the case. Whereas a total contrast to that, I remember going to Seismic in Houston, Texas. It's kind of like an immersive art installation similar to Malwolf, and there was one piece that really got my attention there by muralist Erica Raven. And it was a long hallway, really tall mural. And the light, the LED lights were slowly shifting color very subtly. And there was this ambient music playing. And she had painted it with inks, different, red and blue inks. And so certain inks would appear at times with the light and disappear with others. And then they would all come together, etc. Very slowly shifting. And we just sat on that chair, and we were there for, 20 minutes to half an hour, fascinated by this image that was transforming before us. And again, I've been awed and floored by different pieces of, quote unquote AI assisted work so far, but like nothing has like stopped me in my tracks to just like gawk for half an hour. And another thing that comes to mind that I haven't seen as much when it comes to critique is I've been feeling that there's I'm curious about what could be lost with the disincentivization of the process of creativity. And I'm speaking very much from personal experience here in regards to going into a flow state with the work. I approach drawing like a dance. It's a process of discovery, and there are mistakes that are made along the way, and there are a lot of happy accidents that happen. But it's a big part is about the process itself. And sometimes like committing to that process, even if there's no knowledge of what that end product is going to be, lots of surprises along the way. And I've, personally found a lot of meaning making through that dance and that kind of like surfing of the creative process. I know that, similar concerns have been voiced by David McKean and Android Jones about this as well, in regards to, like David McKean mentioned, the process of taking a walk. And we don't take a walk to like, bam, get to the other place immediately, but there's a meandering, there's a discovery along the way. And not that, when it comes to like art therapy, not that AI can't be used for art therapy, but specifically the physiologically embodied process of engaging with, a work, even if, it doesn't even need to be professional, but totally private. A concern I have is like the disincentivization of people even wanting to learn how to draw and stumbling across something that could actually like save their life or bring them to tears unexpectedly, because that's what it's done for me. So that was a tangent, but just wanted to put that out there.
I want to speak to that directly because this week is, just to like timestamp this episode, this is the week that everyone on Facebook was sharing their Lensa selfies, right? Yeah. And I went ahead and I made a bunch of my wife, which, I knew I had her consent and it was going to be a gift kind of a thing. So I went and I trained the algorithm on specific batches, like one batch based on, the first 10 years of our relationship, and then one of just the few years right before she became a mother. And like, I'm going to do a third, which is like her as a, the images, the most recent images of her. And it's interesting how different they are. But at any rate, like, one of the things that I noticed was that very early in our relationship, and I still have this picture, I made a pencil drawing of her sitting at a piano. And, the process of like referencing her and like studying her face and like really attending to her in that way, it was awesome and beautiful and inspiring to see all these images that were coughed up by this algorithm. But I definitely felt dissociated from exactly that thing that you're talking about, the Dave McKean walk of like, and this morning, my daughter asked me to draw her on our little dry erase board. And so I realized I was drawing my daughter for the first time in probably 2 or 3 years. And that this was, this is a thing that I've fallen out of habit of doing, is like, actually like life drawing and portraiture and drawing people's faces. And, my wife said something when we were talking about this very issue this morning. She said something to the effect of, it's going to be like cursive, huh? Like it's going to be a thing that like, it's a dying language, like it's not that to bring Kevin Kelly back up in a good way. Kevin makes the point that the expanding space of technological possibility seems to, in general, preserve everything that has come before. There are still people I know. Topher, you and I both know, James Herman Stroud in Texas, who naps flint. The dude is practicing a 1,000,000-year-old art form still, and selling flint napped goodies. And so like, that exists, but like flint napping was a thing that, everyone knew someone who napped Flint back in the day. And now, I know probably, 100 people that know the same guy who naps Flint, and so, yeah.
Yeah, there's probably some of that.
I think I agree with Kevin there. In general, I with the exception of all of the ugly stuff that comes with the capitalism layer of progress and all of that, stuff that we will never solve if we talk about it for hours and hours. Setting that aside, generally I'm in favor of more progress the better, because it doesn't actually limit what we can do. It just increases the possibility space. So I flew to Mexico a month ago. If I had to walk here, I would have never made it. It would have taken me a really long time. I'm glad that I can be here now, but I still take a walk every day, because a walk is good for my mental health. And there are things that you see on walks that you don't see in a car or an airplane, right? So I like the expanding possibility space, and I will continue to draw the old-fashioned way. I do think that you're right that fewer people will learn to draw as a kid because of this technology, and that is kind of sad. I think we need to mourn something anytime there's new progress, right? There's something that is a trade-off, but overall, I would say I am so excited for a 5-year-old kid, like the 5-year-old me who had that idea of the story of the, kid breaking his leg. That was my art therapy when I was that age, that turning into my own personal Pixar movie that I share with my family and friends. That is so cool. And I can't wait for that. And there will be as many Pixar films as there are kids. And that's something to deal with. But also I think it'll be a long tail. There will always be some that burst through and tell a common story that resonates with everyone. And I hear you, Topher, on not seeing yet the stuff that moves you from this. And I think that's to be expected. It took a while before someone used a camera to create, Ansel Adams photographs, or after the development of film. It took a while before Kubrick came on the scene and did something super masterful with it, right? Not that Kubrick was the first or Adams was the first, but these are just examples of maestros that didn't have their tool and then got their tool and then had to work in community to figure out the best practices before they could become the maestro that they are. And I think that's what's happening right now. We're all part of that process of figuring out what these tools can do. And I think within the next few years, I will be absolutely moved to tears by something that somebody creates with AI. And, maybe one of us will be one of those people, maybe not. But I'm excited so I didn't mention this, but this t-shirt is AI. Right before I left on my trip, I custom printed a few AI designs to wear. And I love that, I have a personalized, piece of art that I made with the help of this stuff on my body. And so I don't need to be the Kubrick of AI as long as I'm scratching an itch with it, if that makes sense.
Exactly. I have a duffel bag that's my art and a dress that's my art. So when I travel and then when I give gifts now, it becomes this much more personal way of giving. So I've probably given out 30 files as gifts in the last week. And now I have friends coming and asking for, hey, can we do a commission so that my friend can have this thing that's like a kimono or a puzzle? Or it's amazing what people are coming up with and seeing as things they want in their lives that might be practical and not just art on the wall. Which makes me really happy. It's accessible, It's not something that feels like fine art or that it's just for elite people. It's something that everyone can get around and use.
It's also not all or nothing, right? Personally, I mostly currently use AI as a comping tool or for thumbnailing, that sort of thing. But, it's not
totally.
I'm still painting, I'm still using my hands to paint. So I'm still doing that process. It's just kind of making thumbnailing a lot faster and giving me more options to look at.
Can I ask a question that we touched on just very briefly in passing, and I think it deserves more attention, which is this larger problem that also, again, Stephen Zapata talked about in his critique, that is about there's a huge difference between stable diffusion for visual art and dance diffusion for music. And that difference is that Stability AI, the organization, was very careful only to use music in the public domain to train that algorithm. And yet the scraping of billions of images to train the visual algorithm was completely reckless and unbounded. And there has been, anyone listening to this, I'm sure, has seen at least one artist who found out that their name actually pinged a totally obvious, like, oh, my work was used to train this thing. Mine was not, hilariously. I feel like I was left out.
Yeah, left out of the Akashic records. Yes.
Right. In some way, like, it's clear I've been trying immensely hard to do this, and it's not delivering recognizable Michael Garfield stuff. So, like, in a way that it's kind of cool, but there's a blessing and a curse to falling through the cracks, right? Like, lack of visibility is good if you don't want to get caught committing a crime. It's bad if you're trying to get welfare, right? And so, these things, when I think about AI, and I've had this conversation with folks at SFI, actually, like very recently, I had this conversation about, the question of, consent in uploading, basically, because there's this fantastic science fiction story, Lena, by Quantum. It's a pseudonymous author, but this was a story that inspired one of my favorite science fiction novels, Accelerando by Charles Stross, which was largely about, this question of, unauthorized duplicates of people. And, this question of, like, what happens if you're in Lena, for people, Lena is I forget her whole name, but the name of this Swedish model whose face was used for Kodachrome, photo, color testing. And she never consented to having this shot of her from, like, Playboy 1973 or whatever, duplicated indefinitely for this stuff. But now it's like, that is the test kit that's being used for all of this stuff. And, similarly, like Greg Rakowski, Roger Dean, these people that are historically, very averse to getting ripped off, and again, concerned about their livelihood as artists. I mean, it's funny to me that the, Avatar 2 is coming out right, in just a couple weeks, and that there is that notorious lawsuit that Roger Dean leveled at James Cameron for ripping off, like, shot by shot, his own album artwork for Yes and Journey for the Avatar films. And now people are, like, going into Midjourney and, like, making, like, oh, I want to do me as a Na'vi, and so there's, like, this weird circularity to it all. But I mean, ultimately it does get, I mean, even if we don't get to the point like they did in Lena, where, the duplicate of you online has its own subjectivity and experience, and you're creating a literal hell state for this, these uploads that are, like, having to, wake up and find themselves disoriented as, a digital software object over and over and over again. There are these questions about, how this is going to change the way that we think about likeness rights. And, like, obviously our intellectual property model now is deeply, deeply flawed. We talk about that on Future Fossils all the time. But where do you see the new equilibrium? I mean, and you've already said, we're going to run with this in every possible direction. Okay, but new norms have to emerge around this stuff, and new regulations are going to have to emerge around this, and everyone knows it. So, like, where do you all see that flowing?
The concern I have is, like, something like a company like Disney, looking to own the rights to an artist, to an actor, to, like, a star, where it's like, I think a couple of movies have actually kind of play with this idea, where they own your digital version, your digital likeness. You can go off and fuck off to Hawaii, whatever, just do your thing, right? But that digital version is going to be acting or whatever on the screen. That's where I'd be particularly concerned about, that sort of issue.
So the movie The Congress, for example. Absolutely. But I think we're going to also end up with something more like where the music industry is, where you can have 100 authors on one song. And as we begin to really look at the whole lineage of a body of work, you may have micropayments and a different way of dealing with attribution as well. How much of that will end up in the metadata, I think, is where policy and the creative industry are going to start to rub, especially in the coming year. As it gets a sense that, the policies of how attribution are dealt with are currently not standardized around the globe either. And the next decade is where most of that is going to be decided, not just in the EU, where data policies are much clearer about attribution. In the US, we just don't really have a clear lineage of attribution when it comes to metadata. I don't think metadata is going to look the same a decade from now as it does now when it comes to tracking all of the creators that might have contributed to a process.
So this actually gets to, another Kevin Kelly thing that he talked about in The Inevitable, which was this idea that we're going to be able to have like garage automobile manufacturers where, and he didn't, I can't remember whether he did or did not explicitly invoke the blockchain. But Julian, you and I have talked about this, about, the idea that we'll be able to just drop out a piece of, a cool idea. And rather than having to go through the whole process of patenting it, you'll just register it on some distributed ledger. And then, the cool thing is like good actors can then, trace this sort of like NFT style thinking, and you get automatically redistribution of, you get automatically, a little royalty payout anytime somebody took the fender that you said, oh, we're going to put that on our startup car, or whatever. And then you've got Holly Herndon, right, who did Holly Plus, where she actually took a voice clone of herself and then decided she was going to use a DAO to manage the likeness rights for her own voice. And so other people, like she did this cool thing at Sonar Festival a couple of years ago, where like she had a mic and you can pass the mic around and people can sing and it sounds like Holly, but you can't use it without getting an approval from the DAO. And of course, that's nonsense. Piracy, is this sort of ineradicable force like viruses. Viruses are just a fact of life. And so like, it's naive to think that, that system is going to solve this.
The arms race is going to keep going.
Yeah.
I think it's one thing to enable better solutions or new, more digital age appropriate solutions. And it's another thing to think of those solutions as needing to be all encompassing in order to be valid. A lot of the, let's say, blockchain or distributed ledger based solutions are really interesting, and they open up models for sharing that physically they weren't possible before in the digital age, but they're not perfect. They're far from perfect. You can still route around them and hack around them. And, they don't penetrate into the physical world well enough that if you sold a car via NFT, that would prevent the car from getting stolen or something, and so kind of like managing our expectations around the limits of these things can be helpful in thinking about their viability. I think what you were talking about in terms of, shared attribution, like Evo was talking about, and micro payments where somebody can download a car and print it in their garage, but each separate part was 3D modeled by different designers and they all get a micro payment payout for each individual part. It's very possible. There will still be people that hack a system like that. I guess right now where so much is happening so fast that we can't actually get regulation out ahead of the technology development, and they don't want to be the chilling effect. They don't want to get into the middle of it and stop the innovation and say, no, you can't, you can only build what we can regulate. And so like it's going to continue to stay ahead. And even, for instance, let's say the most moral possible or most ethical AI library were to come around where it was 100% opt-in and no artists were in it that did not completely opt in so that nobody could have any of those issues. That's not going to put Stable Diffusion or Midjourney back in the bottle. So that software is already out there in the wild. You can't make it go away just because you came up with a more ethical way of going about it. And it'll be hard for them to compete because the database will be smaller of artists that it's deriving from. And so then the now wild pre-censorship version would just still be a little better visually.
Yeah, these censor billions of images.
Yeah, it's like 5 billion images.
Yeah.
And some of them are completely random. They're not artwork at all. They're just stuff online. But so, I mean, I think there's definitely a more ethical way than the way we just launched all this, or the world just launched all this stuff out. But I don't know that it's going to be able to get out there and get ahead fast enough, or get to level to neck and neck with what's out there fast enough that it will gain the lead. And so you have to accept that there's going to be a legitimate marketplace where people are doing legitimate business on these platforms. And then there's going to be what people decided to hack. And that's going to be floating around all over the web too. And it's all going to have to coexist.
Yeah. I just posted in the chat, haveibeentrained.com, where you can search the Lion database, a couple of the Lion databases, to see what images are in there.
I agree with you, Julian, that I just don't hold out hope that policymakers and regulators are going to get ahead of this stuff. And this is a meta problem on all tech at this point, right? Like the meta problem being that like our system of governance selects for ideologues who are good at raising money and campaigning, rather than selects for people who know what the fuck they're doing when it comes to regulating technology and stuff. So, and that itself, I think, is a problem that will only get worse before it gets better. Probably won't get better until like the U.S. government collapses. In my view, like I really think that things are going to get dire before we get a governance system that can actually deal with these things responsibly. And I would love to be wrong on that. I would love to see our governance system somehow reinvent itself. But just having worked in that world as long as I have, I'm pretty cynical. So all that said, I'm trying to take a perspective of what is my own ethical relationship to this, since I can't rely on policymakers to outsource this. I wish I could, because that's a much better solution than us all volunteering to be good people. But the way I'm making sense of it is basically if I make any money off of AI art, and a big part of that art was prompted by an artist's name, like this shirt. James Jean is one of my favorite artists, and he was a major part of this prompt. If I started selling these shirts, I would voluntarily give him a cut. I don't know what that cut would be. I figured that out, but I just feel like that's the only way that I can have a sense of integrity around this, because I don't think it's the same as like, if I made this by saying like goopy, drippy, colorful t-shirt or whatever, then I don't owe anybody, right? But like if I'm using somebody's name and it's their distinctive style behind that artist, I feel like at that point they deserve some of the value that was created.
I mean, I can completely relate to that, but then I started asking myself, well, what if I've used 8 or 10 names of very different artists and none of the results look like any of their bodies of work?
Yeah.
Because I've mashed in so many styles now that you could never recognize who that's supposed to look like. It's completely distinctive. I've even been doing that with film styles lately, putting several of my favorite directors' names. And once you put enough names in there, there's no way to formally credit anyone. It's just too mashed up. There's like,
totally.
There's nothing specifically James Jean or Jodorowsky or about that image. And it makes it more fun. Then I can just start saying this is a point of departure for something new. It doesn't have to be a reference to the past. Like, yes, I used many elements of the past in it. Anyway, I guess my bigger point is just that if I used one artist name, I would feel much more obliged to give a cut to that artist. Where if I've used many, I just feel less so exponentially as I add more artist names and genre names. I'm not obliged to anyone,
Yeah.
I just don't use names unless there's a client on the other end that's asking me to. I mean, I chose to do that for my own work, but in our salons, we also we like to challenge each other to think of another way around to get to the same style or look without using a proper name, just as a way to, maybe get better or to just change the way we're approaching it. I don't know why I got away from using artist names, except that I was an artist agent, and being in that sort of gallery mode, I wanted to be sensitive to where some of the artists in my community didn't want to participate and really wanted to pull themselves away from it. So
can you still affect the same styles generally too without the names?
Yeah. So a lot of my stuff looks like Jodorowsky, but I never use his name. And I have used names of those who are not living, but for the last 3 or 4 months, I've generally avoided, especially living people's names. And that includes, actors, except for Pee Wee Herman, because Pee Wee Herman said he liked AI art and wanted it. So I was like, yeah, let's give Pee Wee something.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, generally I'm of the same inclination where I tried of the 25,000 images I've made in the past 6 months, most of them, the vast majority, I did not use any names, but I made an exception. I have this funny, break my own rule on purpose and break it all the way. So the ones that I've used artist names, I've used a mountain of them, like just a pile. Because somehow that seems cleansing to me, where I'm like, it's all of these artists and they don't even share genres, and it's more about the curiosity of just cramming it all in there and the collision. Yeah. So, I'm kind of go both ways with it.
I am absolutely loving, though. I bought a whole bunch of antiques at auction, and I am taking photographs of old Limoges and hand-painted 1800s art and using that as art niche prompts because it's not in the model. And it's not on anyone else's copyright at this stage, but it's really fascinating what you get out of that.
It strikes me that this conversation is veering rather close to another conversation, which is the question about the relationship between two-parent and multi-parent child raising, and that because people, cornbread suburban, white bread, suburban American types tend to be like, oh, polyamory. Well, who raises the kids? And Chris Ryan, who I've had on the show, talks a lot about other precedents in other cultures where, people find it completely natural to just treat children as the child of an entire village. And, but in those circumstances, what you have are people that are bound to one another, that are aware of their interdependence, and everyone has skin in the game, and everyone has stakes in these children. And that's very different from, circumstances where you're sort of just contributing to something, right now, in a way, the criticism coming from artists that were, it strikes me that this is a situation akin to these stories that you hear from the UFO experience community, where people had, or the X-Files, right? Where someone was abducted and they're they had some weird pregnancy, or, they had tissue removed from them, and, in order to create a fairy hybrid offspring or something, and so, I don't know, Micah, you live in a scene that pays an extraordinary amount of attention to consent, so maybe you're the right person to pop off on this line of thinking. But it strikes me that, that this is, the math on these two things is very similar, and it speaks to this much deeper problem, which is our inability to reconcile the way that these tools that are designed in order to create greater convenience make us sort of less, we end up in a situation where we owe less to one another, or at least we act like we do. And so I'm curious what you all think about that.
I'm glad you brought up consent, because I do think that is what makes I like where you kind of went on that metaphor of like co-parenting and stuff, but I think that's the consent line is where the metaphor doesn't work, right? I'm not a parent, but one of my favorite things about being where I am in basically any like small tropical town, you have packs of street dogs and cats, and I love animals, but I don't like that in Oakland, for instance, every dog is owned by a person and has like a home and needs to be in the home at night. And it's just, whereas here I walk around my neighborhood and I know all of the dogs. I don't know their names. They don't have collars, but I know all of them on site. I have a relationship with 7 dogs and 6 cats in my neighborhood, and they just belong to the place and the community, which I love. It's just such a cool feeling that we're all feeding them, we're all taking care of them, we're all giving them pets as we go by. And I would love to see child rearing be more like that as well, which is obviously the way that humans did it for a very long period of time before we put ourselves into boxes. But the difference is consent. Whereas, James Jean did not consent to raise, art doggies with me. James Jean created a kennel of art doggies and a business for many, many years. And now somebody has clipped open the gate and is stealing his puppies. And if I'm going to be one of those people, I at least want to be, making sure that he gets some of the royalties from that. But I would also love to see art in general move away. Like, the more that we can move away from capitalism, the more that we can create things like basic income and make our ability to survive not connected to our need to create. Because it seems like for all of us, it is a need. It's like we get depressed and weird and sick if we don't produce something creative. And so I would love to decouple my need to create from my need to survive and pay rent. And the more that we can do that, I would love to raise, art puppies with all of y'all and not worry about like who gets the money for it, because it's just fun to pet the puppies. So, does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah.
It sounds, I would love that too. I'd also be concerned about like the unintended consequences of like the strings attached to a hypothetical UBI and falling afoul of whatever authority distributes that. And that's not really a space that we've entered before. There's hints of that in like China's social credit system. And I think that's a very different conversation.
It means testing for it to work, but of course, getting it without means testing is going to be particularly hard in the US for sure.
Mm-hmm. I'd love it. I'd love it to work, but I'm concerned that, ethically doing it is going to be challenging.
I'm curious, just by like a show of hands, who has read The Gift by Lewis Hyde? No?
I think I've heard of it.
Zara, which has weighed in on this conversation. And
Okay.
Scripture Makes This World, which less so, but has also,
Yeah, I'll just say The Gift changed my life, and I don't say that often about books. I'm a voracious fiction reader, but nonfiction, it takes a lot for me to stick with a book beyond the first few chapters. And The Gift was a book that not only did I read the whole way through, but I've come back to time and again. And it's about the gift is art. And he uses the metaphor of the gift as basically the artist is somebody who is born with a gift. And it's this, your muse, whatever, it comes into you, and it's this creative thing that needs to find outlet. And it's like a flowing river, and you are in the way, and you either get in the way of it, or you block it up with trying to, own it or monetize it or whatever. And all of these create blocks, and that creates, a blockage to the flow. And that creates a certain like pain in you as an artist, or you open it up and you allow it to flow as a gift from you. And it has to do with, just sort of the economics and ethics of art as a business. And I hate that artists have to be business people. I hate that I have to be a business person and put a paywall between my creativity and the world, but it is what it is right now. And I think anyone who is interested in thinking about this is should read that book. It's great. So
there's one last question I have for folks, and we kind of touched on this already, but I want to give it its due, because my buddy Michael Jacobs, aka the ungoogleable Michelangelo, wrote a piece recently called "From Mind's Eye to AI," where his critique of all of this, which I've heard other people plenty of other people have made about media generally, and this is Neil Postman in Monopoly, going all the way back to the apocryphal story of Thoth bestowing writing on human beings, and the concern that what happens is that no one's going to remember things because we can just put them in a book. And this is the case. Like when I spoke to Caleb Scharf for Complexity Podcast, and we talked about how I brought up that the human brain case has actually gotten smaller in the last 25,000 years, and as a function of the fact that we are less solely reliant on our own gray matter to do this stuff, because we've outboarded so much of cognition into it's Jeffrey West talks about how each if you put us on a curve of biophysical scaling, each human being living in a modern technological society is actually using as many calories when you count all of the support systems as a 30,000 kilogram mammal. It's insane. It's a King Kong. Each one of us is a King Kong metabolically, in order to have this conversation now with all these servers and, the supply chains and power farms and stuff. Anyway, all of this boils down to, Michelangelo and other people like J.F. Martel, who I heard speak very eloquently in the past about, the way that the TV has replaced the campfire that we all used to gather around. And there's a difference between the red light of a fire and the blue light of a television. And what is that difference? And when I had Adara on this podcast, and we talked about how VR was kind of becoming this prosthetic dream space that we were colonizing without, in the way that people came to the Americas, and we're like, oh, they're uninhabited, and what's in there? And what are we trampling on without realizing it? And so this, Topher especially, perhaps because you have such a long-standing and active dream practice, because for me, when I look at, when I'm up all night dicking around with Midjourney, I am not dreaming. I may be taking melatonin in order to sort of compensate for the fact that my brain isn't going to be producing it while I'm staring at my phone. But I am keenly aware of the fact that I'm interfering in my own natural cycles and processes. And maybe this isn't entirely a bad thing, but I think everyone is pretty well established that we can't do entirely without sleep and dream, and that their dreams have a function. And, so yeah, that yarn ball of stuff, that's the last thing I think really needs to be spoken to in this conversation.
But what was the question? I feel the theme, but
yeah. The question is just are we not only wilting our own abilities to, generate art by hand and the various amazing blessings that come with the, actually engaging that embodied practice as illustrators, as we move on into this extraordinary realm of new creative possibilities. But are we wilting our own imagination? Are we wilting the faculties of our own ability to dream? And that's basically it. Yeah.
I get the question. And I was grappling with that one with a friend yesterday, and I would say that it's both. I don't think as a lifelong book reader, I had to visualize everything while reading all those books. And so I loved the visual arts because I could struggle to make what I saw on the screen or on the page match to whatever degree I was able what I saw in my head. But I had a long-standing practice of visualizing things in my head while reading books. And I'm pretty sure books are migrating mostly to screens, and visual media is more abundant than ever. There are more movies and TV shows than there ever could have been before, and even more available. So I think our generation and everyone that grew up already visualizing, we're just going to get better at visualizing because this is just even better, faster tools. But I think that the saturation of culture with this will give kids less opportunity to flex that muscle on their own the way books would have forced them to. Now they can literally tell it to the computer and the computer will show them something, and they don't have to imagine what that would look like. And so I think in the long run, it does actually risk potentially harming visualization, but not really, because that's a use case. It's how do you present it? Do you really you can optimize for either. Optimize for the embellishing of imagination or optimize for the replacing of imagination. Like it's not an either or question, but that's where the risk of optimization would be, is if you let them be too lazy, they don't fill in enough blanks on their own.
That's where games and design can come in, because you can make it playful to use your own imagination and then see how the AI matches or it doesn't match. You can play with the expectations, but also you can sort of reverse engineer and make gameplay out of the process of getting to an end goal without using the words that you thought you would use. Maybe I've done this with kids, even like 7 and 9 years old, teaching them to use their imaginations, but to also maybe play a context mashup. Or when I teach Midjourney, for example, I encourage people to use both nouns, things that we understand as objects or as scenes, but then to use context that might be abstract or weird, right? And so the juxtaposition of things is really important. And kids, it takes them a while, but they usually will understand weirdness right away if you're asking them to put two weird things together and then describe that as it's generating. Before they even see what the generation comes out, ask them to describe it. And it's amazing what happens in that space because they get lit up so fast. I love doing it with kids, and it's a way in which they begin to see themselves as the storyteller. They begin to expect more from interactive storytelling, especially because they understand that they have a role in the process. They're not just an audience member anymore.
I love that. Yeah, because I suppose with a book, even though you have the role of visualizing what's in the book, you're a bit more audience, than you would be with interactive storytelling.
I think that it comes down to what is the relationship that one has with something like image generation. If there is if it plays a complementary role with one's own imagination, that's one thing. I mean, I'm not, like Micah, you mentioned, I'm not concerned about myself so much, but I am curious about future generations. So it's one thing when there is a sort of like a co-creation going on where one's own imagination and visionary role plays into it. I know, and can relate to, some of Android Jones's process of pareidolia and finding forms in the chaos as part of the creative process. I mean, that's one of my favorite things to do. And I've done that a little bit actually with like abstract Midjourney stuff too, but it is so much more satisfying when I experience it myself. I'm going to bring up a quote from someone else in the meantime. I'm going to follow up on that, but I also want to point out that if one is over-reliant on some of these processes that are, I guess, more disassociated from one's own internal imagination, it could be a problem when one is sort of very reliant on this sort of imagination replacing performance enhancing, image generation drug. And are you just like one EMP blast or, solar storm away from being like, well, what do I do? Awash without it. But there is a quote I want to read you that I've got right here. I don't know who wrote it, but it is from, I was actually meeting up with someone to talk about image generation work. And they saw this in a coffee shop earlier that day. And it says, quote, "Its continued evolution as the perfect tool for expression points to the day when the complete novice can surpass or at least equal the well-trained expert. However, the most important aspect of the creative process that can never be so easily imitated is the deep satisfaction associated with mastery of a skill. End quote.
I like that. Yeah, just last night I saw, thanks to William Serrell, who's an amazing member of the Future Fossils Facebook group, I saw a story called The Silver Eggheads by Fritz Lieber, 1959, that talked about, this may be the earliest instance of this I have on record, the earliest I'm aware of anyway, that talked about book mills, like machines generating, like basically a GPT-4 style thing where like all of the narrative fiction in the world was being generated by machines now in this science fiction. And in the first scene of this story, the writers, who are now merely technicians that operate these machines, sabotage them. And suddenly the world is deprived of book mills, and people are sitting around trying to write stories, and they can't because everyone has forgotten how. And I was like, my God, like, you know, every once in a while, somebody like an Olaf Stapledon or something, you know, gets this like so many decades out that it's oppressive. I think that, yeah, maybe the last thing I care to say about this is I agree with what you all have said about, like, the issue is not whether any of us individually stop, quote unquote, developing, like speaking the language, stop developing these skills, but whether there is enough, whether there are seed banks, basically, of people that retain these capacities, so that if there is an EMP, somebody still knows how to build a thing. You know, somebody still knows how to do it.
I just find this so hard to imagine, because especially when you talk about the death of stories or something, like once they've been automated, people forget how to do it. As far as I'm concerned, we are literally made of stories. We are everything that consists, that humans think they are, is just a big giant pile of stories.
The self is a story.
Yeah.
We tell ourselves and each other.
Yeah. So I just can't imagine peeling back enough layers of that onion to get to a place that was like so Buddhist and empty that like we didn't even remember how to make stories. Like, would we even know who we were at that point? Would those people even know their own names? Like, it feels unimaginably far and like a very thin risk. You know, I can imagine humans forgetting advanced engineering much faster, or tax law much faster than they could ever forget, like, how to make stories. You know, that's like the most innate human thing, you know. So, but I think there's a lot of different craft style that does get lost to automation. And I'm kind of okay with it. Like, it came up earlier and I didn't want to interject because everybody had beautiful things to say, but like, maybe it's positive. It's a positive note to close on that. I think it'll only add value. The greater scarcity of handcraft will just make it that much more valued by society. And if anything, we'll see a resurgence of people making that and doing that and the valuing of that as it becomes more scarce, because we'll become so saturated in all the synthetic, you know, images that people will just be like, I just want to feel this around me. I don't want to feel that other thing. And they'll surround themselves with handcraft even more. And I really feel like it's not at risk. Like, we're not going to kill, you know, arts and crafts by using our computers so incredibly well. Quite the contrary. I think it'll make those things be even more revered and held up to be valued.
Plus, there are people who haven't been able to participate in visual art for various reasons. I mean, whether it's disability or chronic illness or whatever. And I think it's, you know, I mean, it's opening that up to them too. So that's another side of it too. I'm not saying like that's the only side of it, certainly, but that's, you know, one thing I don't think has been considered very much is like, I don't feel comfortable with saying like, oh, they shouldn't participate because they haven't put in the time, because, you know, like, it's like, no, like, everyone should have the ability to participate in that if they can, you know, at least generating images. I mean, the consumer side of it is a different story, but.
Absolutely. And like, even in the question of visualization, whether we'll lose our imaginal or visualization capacities, there are people today that literally cannot visualize. They, you know, that already exists. And I don't know, you know, it's it's not an absolute given gift. It's not granted. I personally, my internal monologue, my internal, is verbal. I hear words. I hear a stream of consciousness that is verbal, but not everybody. I don't think it's even 50%, or I don't know what the percentages are, to be honest. Not everybody hears their internal thoughts as words. A large majority of us does, I think, but not 80 or 90%. And I always wonder what it's like inside the minds of those people that don't hear a stream of consciousness as words, or the people that don't visualize 3D visualizations in their heads in full color the way I do. And because obviously they have fully functional minds, So I think like the neurodiversity question, we can't even imagine the kind of adaptations that are waiting for us around the corner. And this is not going to be the only catalyst of them. This is going to be one of many. There may be people who awaken their ability to visualize by using these tools that would not have any other way. They wouldn't have had the patience to stick it out with a pencil. So, I just try and stay open to all the possibility that's out there. Nature is incredibly creative. And there's nothing, the idea that nature is a bounded space and that these things that we're talking about are somehow unnatural, I think is a really offensive way to talk about nature. Like nature has this boundary and it should stay in its yard and this is weird stuff from outside. It's like, no, this is nature, and nature is very creative and it's not going to stop just because we're like confused about what's happening. Anyway, that's my little, soapbox moment. But
it's beautiful to think about all the artists I have changed different media many times in my life based on my ability in the moment. And that includes hand trimmers, for example, right? So all of the artists who stopped painting or doing their glass art or whatever it was because their bodies no longer let them do it, that capacity is wide open again. And it's amazing. I'm watching elders in their 70s and 80s who haven't picked up any sort of illustration tools in 20, 30 years, who are excited about their creative process again for the first time in decades. I that's the part I'm excited to open up, not just in future generations, but right here, right now. I think it will do something extraordinary in terms of public culture and a resurgence of desire for the creative in our daily lives, in our walls, and in every aspect of our life.
Mm-hmm. I, for one, am super excited about being 150 years old with completely failed, mummified corpse of a body, and yet I can XR my way into some telerobotic tantra bot and just like phone all day, like, yay, I still got it. No, that's horrible. But hey, but then again, maybe it's wonderful, right?
Doesn't sound that bad.
I'm prematurely old just by saying that I don't see the value of that possibility. Oh God!
I just want to jump in and say I think we can we might be doing a disservice by even describing this as automation, because at least for me, there is no part of this that my creative process with AI that is automated. It takes a lot of work to get something that is as good as the thing in my head, and so it's more like this process where I'm trying to wrangle the computer to do the thing that I want it to do. And through that process, you get happy accidents. You get a lot of the same stuff that you get when you're involved in a older process like drawing or whatever, but with even more randomness and like more happy mistakes, I would say. So I think a lot of people get confused about this because their only introduction to AI art is trying Midjourney once, typing in one thing, they create something cool, and that seems super automated. They're like, oh, I typed in, and usually their prompt is very short. It's like a beautiful house, and then they get a beautiful house, and they think that that's the end of the process. Whereas some of us are using the tool for hours and hours and hours, and just trying to guide it and sculpt it into what we want to see in our head. And I think that's, at least for me, been good for my imagination. Like because if my imagination needs me to like pick up a pencil and draw something, I'm not going to do that every day. Like I do that maybe once a week. But if I just have something in my head, I'm like, I kind of want to see that. And I'm like sitting in bed, I can just like pull up Discord, I can pop it in, and then like 3 hours later, of course I'm not sleeping, but like I kind of like went down the rabbit hole, whereas I probably wouldn't have picked up the paper and pen, and then that like imaginative urge would have died. And so, yeah, I just want to, I guess, like I worry about the atrophy of the creative spark as well. And I also think that it can like go both ways. So, yeah.
That's a good point.
And that speaks to your earlier comments about, the way in which I think a lot of people misunderstand these tools as just like giving you what you want. Whereas like, I cannot get Midjourney to give me what I want. I can't get it to do it. It's full of surprise and delight, but like it cannot just spit out the thing. Mm-hmm. So,
Sometimes it helps you find what you're actually looking for.
Been able to, because I'll say that when I do, it's thrilling. Like it's not always exactly the thing that was in my head, but it feels like I'm playing a little game, and I won the game by getting it to make the thing that was close to my head. And I'm curious. So when you say you can't get it to do that, are you saying that you never win the game, or it's just kind of a frustrating game a lot of the time?
Well, okay. So this latest series that I did with these sort of, ethereal, unearthly landscapes that I'm waiting on a big order of print canvases of these that I'm going to hang up in a local coffee shop. I made it, I don't know, like a week or so into that process before I hit a sweet spot where every new generation of variants felt good, and I wanted to upscale all 4 of them. And I think that that's the most exciting thing for me about Midjourney specifically, when other people are like, when it's compare contrast. Like my favorite thing about that particular instance of this is like, forking the path of possibility and going back and like being like, okay, I'm going to run variants of that. And the fact that allows you to think about this, like as this has been the oldest thought for me, is that what we're actually doing is animal husbandry. Like you can think about this in terms of, you're not doing the work of breeding those Cocker Spaniels. They're doing the work, but you are curating it in the sense that Brian Eno talked about the most important art form of the 21st century being curation.
Totally.
And so, there is a sense to it in which, it's human on the loop, and that remains important. And then the other part is that, because you're running, you have the option at least to run this bot in a public channel of like I have this Midjourney up in the Future Fossils Discord, and people can run their own variants of my prompts. And I love that social component. Like Evo, you're talking about, that social piece of it. And I think that like there are tools like endless.fm that are exploring this with music, where, your people are like mashing your samples in real time. You're working together in an internet audio workstation. And I think that's a really exciting piece of it. But at the same time, you rescind control when you are co-improvising with other entities, be they, or living or mechanical. And so that's, again, yet another nod to Kevin Kelly in his book Out of Control, which is about, the role of the use of evolution in technology, and how that means that we have to think differently about, what it means to be a cybernetic helmsman, rather than, because they're dealing with the wind and the water and all these factors that they don't really, that they're not regulating top down. And so that's what I mean when I say, like, the most, I felt most pegged by your hippie that was talking about how the AI was like talking to their subconscious through the machine. Like that's something that Scout Wiley and I have been, talking about, is like the use of these tools as a kind of 21st century oracular interface, where it's like the I Ching on a, for computers or something. But that
character was definitely based on you, by the way, Michael.
Son of a bitch. Yeah. But so, yeah, that's it. That's what I mean is like, it's not, you're not sitting there, genetically engineering a de-extincted velociraptor, except, I mean, that's exactly what it is, right? Because the velociraptors totally did not behave the way that that people thought they would. And they were full of horrible surprises. So anyway, that's my rant.
On that note.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for being a part of this. If anyone else has closing thoughts, now's your time. But otherwise, I think people these are amazing artists, each of you in your own way. And you should, if you're listening to this, if you don't know who these people are, you should go now and follow them. So
thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. It was a good conversation.
Well,
thanks,
one last
Michael.
One last thing that I've been really excited about, touching upon something that Micah mentioned earlier, is I've started to just do image to image, where I will upload different pieces of my own artwork that I've made. Like, here's a drawing, here's a virtual reality sculpture, and then mashing those together and seeing what happens. And that's been a very exciting thing to do, to mash up different styles of my own existing work together from different eras and see what happens.
Exactly.
Using old sketchbooks as image prompts.
And then to use that for world building, and to then take that into a generative XR context and say, here's the whole world, taking those images, those 3D models, and even the scripts using, GPT-3 and soon the others. I think we've got such potential for vast storytelling, whole new worlds that aren't necessarily going to look exactly like what we've seen for the last 50 years in storytelling. I feel like almost everything we've seen the last few decades is sequels and derivatives. And now we have this opportunity to be wide open. So as a storyteller, I'm so excited. As someone who just likes to create new worlds from scratch, I want to be able to invite people into that process. And that's wide open now. So that's exciting.
Yeah, and on that, Topher, I'm using not just the hand-drawn part as an input, but also at the last part of the process. When the AI gets it 98% of the way there, but then I pull it into an app like Procreate where I can, do digital art on my iPad.
Totally.
And it's kind of feeling like almost like that middle portion is the part that we're convincing ourselves is a normal thing for a human to do, but it's actually kind of insane. If you've ever been an artist and worked for hours and hours and hours, shading this one little part of this thing, it's kind of insane. And I do it. And all of us as artists, do that kind of, it's like an OCD, sprint to get this thing looking the way that you want it. But I'm kind of excited to see how much more I'll create if I can reduce the amount of time I'm spent doing the, small shading of that little corner of the screen and doing the more front end and back end where I'm imagining the thing and then I'm doing that final polishing touch on it. So
Totally.
that's what I'm excited about. So, oh my God, I feel like we could talk about this for so long.
Yeah.
So that's the last thing I'm going to say.
Yeah. And one other thing I just started doing is generating things that look sculptural and then using those as reference to make, 3D work in VR. So cool. Doing a collab with someone else in Gravity Sketch or something simultaneously. And we're both referencing, a Midjourney image, and then we're working on different parts of that and sculpting it in 3D, etc.
Yeah.
Changing mediums.
Sounds hot.
Between even midstream with remixing in Midjourney, you can make something a paper cut, make it a sculpture, make it a painting, and it changes how it interprets it. Sometimes in unexpected and interesting, or unexpected and horrifying ways.
Well, on that note, I can feel the resentment vibes coming off my wife right now for not helping with these kids. So I'm going to scoot. Thank you all again so much. If I can, y'all have a great.
Love it.
Take care.
Thank you guys so much.
Take care, y'all.
Much love.
Cheers. Be well.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Once again, Future Fossils is an entirely listener-supported show. I have children, and I would love to make this show sustainable, finally, in 2023. So if you enjoyed this conversation and the others that I host, please bop on over to patreon.com/Michael Garfield or michaelgarfield.substack.com and chip in a couple bucks every month. Together, we can radically improve both the frequency and the production quality of this show in the year to come. And also, I have compiled an insanely extensive list of follow-up resources around this conversation, including numerous op-eds written by the panelists that you heard today. That's over at this episode's listing at Patreon. Go check it out. Dive in, form an educated opinion about this stuff. I cannot stress that enough. And with that, I'm going to ring you out with a not quite final mix of my song Life Finds a Way and Hyperstition, which I regard as the most succinct articulation I can offer of both the promise and the peril of advanced technologies enabling us to close the gap between our imaginations and the material world. Enjoy. Thanks again for listening, and we'll be back soon with a conversation with the absolutely wonderful Robert Poynton. Take care.
Pouring rain from forgotten ages, switching given sexes through electric fences, long extinct barrier, smarter than we categories, towering for stories. Life breaks free. Life expands to new territories, painfully, even dangerously. Life finds a way. Climbing out of minds and the films and books and toys and rides, shaping generations, realer than imagination, fiction true as facts, chicken teeth are bad.
Bye.